for joining me here today. As we kind of discussed a little bit, we get a lot of times agents always reach out and they're asking about, well, is the security for this tenant or the financials for this tenant good enough to get the space that they're looking for? It's really a hard question to answer because ultimately it's not like we're dealing with apples and apples all across the board. Every tenant is different. And when it comes to the securitization of a lease, it's all about the risk versus reward for the landlord, and they're going to take a look at who the tenant is as well. So first and foremost, the first question I would ask is, well, who is the tenant? Are they an established business? Do they have history of rent payments that are either more or less if they're growing, but they're showing that they had a good history payment along with the landlord? This goes a long way toward a new landlord looking at the securitization and how they want to approach it. So, and what I mean by that, as an example, for instance, if I were to approach a landlord with a new concept, a new startup idea, essentially I'm a startup. I'm all by myself. I have my personal financials that might be potentially guaranteeing it, but I don't want to do a personal guarantee, so I'm going to try and do a company guarantee. Now, they're probably, because I'm a startup, going to require a really heavy security deposit, potentially 6 months or more, upwards of a year, or a year of security deposit that might burn down as a startup with no history. However, if I am, for example, a AAA rated, S&P AAA rated corporation coming in, wanting to lease the exact same space under the exact same terms, I may be able to get away with absolutely no security deposit. And just because of the strength of the company that's guaranteeing the lease, in addition to the past payment history and experience of the business itself. So in those instances, that's where you have to take a look at who is the tenant. What is the tenant do? What's their experience? Have they ever run a business? How does it look? From there, you're going to request their financials. Typically speaking, most landlords are going to want to see 2 years of tax returns, a application essentially that is going to show a balance sheet, and the current year-to-date profit and loss if it's a company. Now, if it's a startup, they're obviously not going to have 2 years of tax returns. They're not going to have a year-to-date P&L, things like that. But automatically, as a startup, most landlords are going to require a personal guarantee. So you're going to ask for the same information, but this time on the personal level, not on the company level. You're going to ask for the 2 years of tax returns. You're going to ask for a balance sheet on the personal level, which can also be done just on a lease application form. They typically have a assets and debt or liability section, and then you can figure out what the net worth is or the net value of all their assets are. So those are what you're looking for initially. Now, they may require proof of funds, so you may want to have your client be aware that, if you're showing assets on your balance sheet of $300,000-$400,000 cash, they may ask for proof of those funds. That, where are they? Are they sitting in the bank? Are they sitting in some sort of trust account? If it's a retirement account, understand that those are usually protected. So normally those retirement accounts don't go toward actual verifying the security, because a lot of times those retirement accounts are also very much tied or protected rather by law from business issues or foreclosures or defaulting on the lease. So you have to have a full understanding of your tenant. And this is where questions come up, right? So the first thing I always tell agents is that once you do get the financials and you look at them, we all understand where things are going and what a landlord may want, and we're going to actually delve into that a little bit in just a few minutes. But ultimately, the agent should be able to realize pretty quickly, like, well, here's my client, here's who they are, do they have the financials for it? If not, then we're going to have to make adjustments. What are some of the other ways to go about it? What can we do? And we'll discuss those options as well later on. But when we're looking at that with the tenant, now we're looking at, well, what kind of security are they willing to put down, as well as what the landlord is willing to take. Now we have to look at it, and part of negotiation, everything I've always said about negotiation is about putting yourself in the other person's shoes, having some empathy, somewhat. That's what defines us as human beings, different from animals, is that we have empathetic ability to empathize with what other people are thinking or understanding them by putting ourselves in their shoes. So let's take a look at what the landlord's looking at, okay? Because if you're a tenant rep and you're representing the tenant, you have to be able to convey exactly what the landlord's also going to be wanting from that tenant to be able to get the lease. Otherwise, you're just spinning your wheels. So landlord number one, as we discussed, they're going to look at the past history of the business. They're going to look at their operating history, their track record of payments, make sure they've never been evicted before or things like that. From there, the landlord's going to look at, as a business, how are they going to operate? When you open your doors, especially if it's like a retail business or something like that, your sales aren't going to be day one, through the roof. Now there are certain exceptions to this, of course, like for instance, we've all seen those ads where Chick-fil-A is opening up a new location and people line up for 3 or 4 days to be the first ones in line so that they can get free Chick-fil-A for a year, kind of thing, right? But QSRs, or quick service restaurants, fast food restaurants, typically people see the construction, they see the build around it, so when they do open up, there's a big bang and they do have a lot of business from day one. In fact, they typically have more business when they first open, and then it slowly drops off to a normal level, stabilized level, after a couple months, because people want to try something new. So that being said, though, majority of businesses aren't like that. People are going to have to find them. They're going to have to go out there. They're going to have customers, sure, but they're going to have to also understand how they're going to attract those customers in. And it can take up what we call a ramp-up period. How long is it going to take them to ramp up to become a stable business where they're actually generating income that they expected to? During that time, a landlord's going to be concerned. If you have no income coming in, how are you going to pay rent? So they're going to want to see reserves. In addition to a security deposit, they're going to want to see that you have capital that you can at least sustain the business for a certain period of time, whether that's 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. That really depends on the type of business. It depends on the landlord, and it depends on the location, geographically speaking, as well as whether or not it's a prime location or not. So all that plays a factor into all of this when they take a look at it. So the landlord immediately, in addition to the operating history, they're going to also want to look at, does the tenant have operating reserves to be able to sustain that business until it gets up and running. From there, typically speaking, a landlord gives concessions, whether it's in the form of abated rent or whether it's in the form of tenant improvement dollars. In retail, they typically give an abated rent where the tenant is improving the building, because a lot of times those improvements are specific to a retailer's look and use and not really reusable. So a new tenant's going to come in and tear it out and redo it themselves anyways. So instead of giving tenant improvement dollars, a lot of landlords instead give abated rent. But the last thing a landlord wants to do is give 6 or 7 months of abated rent for the first year, and then within the first 6 months, that tenant defaults. Because now the landlord's out 6 months rent, plus the potential for the lease, plus the potential for the eviction and everything else that they gave. So they're going to look to try and securitize that based upon, again, the risk of the tenant. Meaning, if you're a mom and pop and it's a startup, they're going to want to try and securitize all of their abated rent as much as they can. And then at the same time though, but if you're coming in and you're Apple, Microsoft, Starbucks, something like that, they're not as worried about that, because they understand that you have the ability to, one, have the reserves, two, that if you do end up having to close or fail, they can still go after you because they're strong enough and they're not really losing out on the abated rent or any tenant improvement dollars that they may have given. Yes.
For tenant improvement dollars, can the tenant use that whenever and however they like? Can they save that for later in the year? Can they do, with the money that they're given?
Okay. Well, I'll start that with the caveat that anything is negotiable in commercial real estate, especially when it comes to leases. However, typically speaking, no. In that the tenant improvement dollars are, and first of all, we have to also think about the logistics of this. If they're going to do it after they move in, it's hard to repair and do things or make modifications to the space once you've moved in and you're working there. Typically speaking, it's done ahead of time. It's not for down the road or whatever. However, at the same time, maybe you might negotiate that, if we exercise the option in 5 years that you're going to install new carpet and paint, things like that. So you might build a tenant improvement into something down the road for the future, but that's rare to see that. And very rarely are you allowed to actually hold it in. Typically how tenant improvement dollars work is the tenant, it's for certain things, specific items that are carved out. The tenant spends their money to pay for those items, and during a set schedule, they request reimbursement from the landlord, who then reimburses the amount up to the tenant improvement dollars that they're going to contribute.
I was saying more, for instance, you do the necessary steps and build outs to get your business running, and you still have leftover dollars, but you go, okay, I want to add this, I want to light the sign up.
You can add and do things along those lines at that time. But usually there is a time frame for your build out, and usually it covers those items. It's a good question though, in that you might want to add a couple items in your tenant improvements that can be added into that would be part of that when you're talking about your tenant improvement plan with the landlord, which is drafted before the lease is signed, or concurrently when the lease is being drafted, and then signed at the same time, so that everyone understands exactly where that money is going to. Now, typically speaking, if they have tenant improvement dollars and they don't use them all, they don't get a refund of that. However, I have seen people negotiate certain deals where you can convert your tenant improvement dollars on a 50 cent to $1 ratio into rent. Meaning, let's say I had $10 in tenant improvements dollars that was given, but I only used $3 or $4, which is, I'm using these numbers for round numbers. That's kind of unrealistic. $3 or $4 a square foot in tenant improvement dollars doesn't even get you flooring in this day and age. But let's just say I use $3 or $4 and I have $6 or $7 in tenant improvements left. And let's say it's 4 and 6. So I only used 40% of my tenant improvement dollars. I have 60% left, or $6 left. Sometimes I've seen it where I can convert that $6 into $3 per square foot of rent. And instead of using it. So it's a win-win for everybody in that, I do get some benefit from negotiating a higher tenant improvement dollars and being efficient in my expenditure so that it costs less than what I was anticipated. And as such, I'm still getting some benefit, but the landlord's also getting a benefit because it's only half the amount, as opposed to I'm going to spend every last penny and add things I don't really need or want. I'm going to upgrade the baseboards because I have an extra $2 a square foot in tenant improvement dollars. That doesn't necessarily make sense for people to do or want, and even for a landlord, they'd rather instead give half that in free rent. So I know we went off subject a little bit, but I hope that answers your tenant improvement dollar question.
A little shorter question. When would the statute of limitations on when you could use them end?
Well, it's not really a statute of limitations. It's not governed by law. It's governed by the lease contract.
Oh, okay.
So that's all negotiable, but typically it's upfront, right at that time, within the first few months of the lease period itself. So now that we talked about tenant improvement dollars, that's definitely something that a landlord's going to want to try and securitize. The free rent, the tenant improvement dollars, the build-out costs, the moving costs. In addition to all of that, when they do the budget, and the reason why landlords want to understand exactly what the tenant improvements are is that they're contributing a certain amount, but they have a pretty good idea of what it's going to cost, and it may cost more and likely will. Very rarely do you have a landlord that it does what they call a build to suit, a full build to suit. And usually they just kick in a certain amount of tenant improvement dollars and they build to a plan. But with that plan, the landlord already knows roughly how much it's going to cost. If there's going to be a delta between the tenant improvement dollars that they're giving versus the total cost, they're going to want to make sure the tenant has that money in addition to the reserves that we talked about earlier, right? So they're going to want to make sure the tenant has the build-up cost saved up. They're going to want to make sure that the tenant has moving costs ready to go. Their wiring costs to wire out the suite or whatever they may have to do to get that space ready for business. So that's what a landlord's really looking at, the full picture of everything, not just securitizing that lease, but also making sure that there's reserves that are in place to, one, sustain the business, but also to move the business. You know, because it can be relatively expensive. Just moving a 3,000 or 4,000 square foot office space can cost $20,000-$30,000. You know, and when you look at it, and those are costs in addition to any kind of tenant improvements or anything else. I'm talking about just straight moving. When you look at, you know, the stationery, the movers, the wiring, you know, all that stuff going into it, it can cost quite a bit just to move that space. Landlords use that fact to play off of tenants to keep them there, to push the rents when it comes time to renew. But, you know, if you understand what the moving costs are and the expectations, you can easily do financial numbers to determine whether this location is going to be financially better than the one next door or down the street when it comes time for the renewal. So, as a tenant now, my goal is to get as low a security deposit as possible, obviously, because I don't want the landlord holding onto my funds for that long of a period. And there's different ways that we could do that to be able to securitize that lease. Now, again, putting yourselves in the other party's shoes. As the tenant, if I'm looking at the landlord, my concern as a landlord is probably more upfront than it is down the road. Historically speaking, if we look at the numbers, the majority of businesses fail within the first 2 years. You know, the first year is one of the hardest ones, and then the second year, again, has a high failure rate when combined in there. We're upwards of 90% potentially of all business, the new businesses getting started within the first 3 years. So that period is when and every year that the business is alive, the chance that it failing and going out of business falls. So risk versus reward, as we discussed, everything about the security on a lease is all about the risk. So as the landlord has less risk down the road, they may want a high security deposit up front. So if I'm representing the tenant, my argument is if we give you the high security deposit up front, I'd like to burn it down. Meaning, we'll give you 6 months of security deposit up front, but after the first year, I want to be able to use one of those months to pay off the rent, so you're only holding 5 months. After the second year, I want 2 more months to be burned off, so that you're only holding 3 months of security deposit. And then after the third year, you know what? Almost all the risk of that company failing is pretty much gone. So I want 2 more months to be burned off as security deposit, the security deposit into rent, which then now the landlord's now holding 1. That's a win-win negotiation. You're solving the needs of the landlord, understanding that his concern is risk mitigation. But you're also explaining to the landlord that that risk mitigation is really in the first parts of the lease. And so you're negotiating it so you have a burn down. Those are the ways to do that as a tenant rep. Understand who your tenant is. Meaning, if you're coming in with an extremely strong tenant that, and also understand when we talk about extremely strong tenants, we're not just talking about tenants that have extremely strong financials, but also perhaps they might be tenants that have a lot of P&E money behind them that are growing very quickly, that are, you know, like as we used to say, old school terminology, belle of the ball, meaning everybody wants them. So, you know, you see these concepts that are hot and trendy and they want them, so they attract them and they get them. Landlords are willing to do more to attract them to come in, even if their financials may not be as strong as other companies. Just because when you look at how they're doing so well that they're almost investing in them. We see this with emerging brands a lot, especially with fast food, where we see fast food companies that may, they may only be 100 units or so because they're brand new, but their average unit volume is twice as high as all the McDonald's or something along those lines. So you know right away that, this is something that might be a pretty darn good tenant to have in my place. So landlords will give more concessions in that case for them than they would for a regular startup or a company that's only been around for a couple of years kind of thing. So really understanding, number one, when it comes to securitizing lease, there's a quick 3-step process. And that is, one, understanding who the tenant is. You have to know if the tenant is, how strong they are, how their operational history, how long they've been in business, how many locations, all of that. In addition to that, from there, you then have to look at, let's look at what the landlord's looking at for their risk. How are they going to weigh that risk? Versus their financials, what they have on paper. Meaning if they're a startup, but they have millions of dollars funded, the landlord may be pretty open to getting them in there with very low security deposits. But understanding how it looks when it comes to the security versus the tenant and their financials. So that's all a picture of it. And how is the landlord going to look at it? What are you asking for on behalf of the tenant that the landlord's going to look at? Well, I'm giving this up front, so I want to be able to mitigate my risk of the tenant going out of business in the first year and losing everything I gave. Okay, so that's the second step. First, understanding who the tenant is, who your tenant is. Second, understanding what the landlord's going to want. And then the third part is simple. It's trying to negotiate a balance where everybody, or, as the old saying, I like to say where everybody's happy, but, the old saying is that the best negotiation is when nobody's happy, because that way, both parties left something on the table. Meaning they had to give up and had to concede something, and it was a win-win negotiation, versus if one party's ecstatic and one party's upset, then that negotiation was probably favored on the one party than the other. So, the third part of that whole thing when it comes to tenant securitization is that negotiation. Being able to structure a deal that works for your tenant and the landlord, that addresses all of each party's concerns. And ultimately, that's how every landlord should, and majority of landlords will look at this. Okay. So I hope that helped with understanding the securitization and the financials for your tenants. One thing I do want to throw out there. When you do get the financials, if the financials are all over the board or mixed in with the business financials or mixed in with the personal financials and things like that, we have to understand that that's not normal. And that landlords are going to look at this as, if this person doesn't know how to do basic general accounting, can they run that business continually? Can they grow it? Can they sustain that business? Maybe they were just lucky the last few years and they've been kind of flying by doing whatever they wanted, commingling funds on the personal and the business and not really keeping good tracks. If we have really bad books and records, that's a red flag. Okay, so be aware of that, and that's where you have to step up and let your client know right away. Hey, I thank you for the financials. I see that we do have a couple of issues I think landlords are going to have with them. So we may have to put in either a heavier security deposit or restructure it, or if you have the ability for a letter of credit, something along those lines. And that's when you start exploring it. If they don't have the financials and you can tell that it's a startup and they only have 1 month's of security deposit saved up and they only have a small amount saved up for reserves, your concern then is you can also, or rather, there are still potentially options. It's just that they're not going to go to the highest Class A, newest property with the landlords in the best neighborhood or corner. What they're probably gonna have to find is a mom and pop that owns 1 or 2 properties, older, C-class, that they can go into. Because those landlords typically make more concessions for startups because that's who they're dealing with in these C-class properties. So understand there's still some options, it's just that you have to make the expectations realistic to what their financials look like. All right?
Thank you.
Absolutely. Any questions?
Maybe we can go over the SBA financial process just because you mentioned it to me.
Yep.
And that way they know.
Okay. So yeah, when it comes to SBA, there are some situations where your tenant or your client may be getting SBA financing for growth and for growth or expansion or to acquire a business. Typically speaking, if they're acquiring a business, they're probably acquiring the lease as well, in which case they're just going to inherit that, and there's really not anything to worry about when it comes to the landlord coming in. However, if they're acquiring a business and looking for a new location, well, you're still going to run through the same problems, but the nice part is that you do have a third-party lender, SBA financing, and actually a bank and the government taking a look at this and verifying that the business is sustainable for that purchase price and the lease rent amounts. So that should give some comfort level automatically to a landlord. That being said, the landlord still is probably going to require personal guarantees, and they're still going to require a security deposit. It just may not be as substantial as one where someone's just coming in and saying, I'm a startup, I have nothing else, because they've gone through the process that's taken a month and a half to get SBA approval for their expansion, and SBA has already vetted out much more so than most, I would argue, if any landlord. They're going to vet out a tenant getting an SBA loan more than any landlord would ever vet out the tenant for their lease. So that's an added security layer for them. Them being the landlord. Okay. It's also potentially an added leverage and negotiating position for you. I have a well-qualified tenant that is, if you're representing the tenant, I have a well-qualified tenant that is been approved by SBA for their expansion. And here are the guidelines that SBA's approved. A lot of landlords are going to be happy to accept something along those lines. Okay?
I have a question on personal guarantee.
Yes.
If the second party guarantor or person making the guarantee has weaker financials than the original actual tenant, is that a better or worse situation?
Well, I mean, typically speaking, it's going to be worse, because, but at the same time, the way guarantees work, okay, so if your tenant is signing the lease, and they're not personally signing it, they're signing it under the business, that business is guaranteeing that lease. If the business financials are weak, but stronger than the guarantor, they're still guaranteeing that business. The guarantor is a secondary guarantee as well. So in addition to whoever's signing the lease, whether it's the business, whether it's them personally, there's a third-party guarantor. That could be a family member, that could be another business that they own, or something along those lines. Now, if their financials are weaker than the tenants, then if I'm as a landlord, I'm like, well, why do I want that? Again, take yourself out of the picture of representing the tenant. Put yourself in the landlord's shoes. Okay? I'm looking at the tenant. I'm like, well, they're not that strong. I want a personal guarantee. And the problem is, your personal guarantee, it's even worse than the tenant. So how is the landlord going to be happy with that? The only way they're going to be happy with it is maybe it's slightly worse, and the two of them together make sense as a guarantee for the one. You know, very rare that may happen though, because they're going to look at it as, well, you know, your guarantor is actually even weaker than you. Well, why do we even have that guarantee then? Okay, So put yourself in the other party's shoes. Always do that. And then I think when you do that, you can answer those questions of, well, how does it look? What's it going to be like? Well, think about what, if I'm the landlord or if you were the landlord, what would you say? What would you think? You know, use your common sense in those situations, and that should be able to guide you for 90% of the deals. Unless you're in an LA submarket where everybody's crazy, just kidding. But yeah, so just be aware of that, you know, just understand the whole picture. And that's also, one last thing I do want to say at the end of the class here is that I ran into tenants that have only given partial pictures of their financials because they think that that's all the landlord needs to see. Well, first of all, you should be explaining to your landlord that, or your client if you're representing the tenant, that the stronger your financials look, the better the deal we're going to be able to negotiate. The more tenant improvement dollars we're going to be able to get, the lower the rental rate, because it's less risk for the landlord, so they're going to be happier. It's not just about show me your financials and this is your security deposit. It's about everything. It's a big picture when it comes to the landlord. So you have to explain that to the tenant. If you're going to give me piecemeal financials that are not your whole financials, it's going to hurt the negotiation. In addition to that, how does it look if it comes back? Again, taking the step back as the tenant rep, putting yourself in the landlord's shoes, how is it going to look to the landlord if the landlord comes and says, oh, well, the financials aren't good enough. You know, we're going to need personal guarantee or this or whatever else. Then all of a sudden, oh, we got this as well. Think about that. You know, first question comes to my mind as a landlord is, what else are they hiding and why? Okay? You know, the tenant and the landlord are getting into a long-term relationship. Meaning the people that we deal with, minimum 3 years, probably 5 to 10. If that's the case, you don't want to start it off by hiding stuff or lying about your financials or anything else. You don't never want to start a relationship off by doing that. Be upfront. Put it out there. It is what it is. It's not like it's going to look any better by not showing it. You know, all it does is give red flags. But if you show that there's motivation and that you're willing to work with the landlord, that goes a long way as well. Okay. So you have to explain that to the client. You know, let them know what their weaknesses are and how they can overcome that. Sometimes overcoming it is just being extremely responsive and working, you know, meaning quickly responding, not agreeing to everything, but just being very responsive so that they realize that, hey, you know, at least if we go in with this person, I'm not going to have to chase them. I'm not going to have to argue with them. I'm not going to have to, you know, where are they? Who are they? We have a continuing relationship or talking at least. So that can go a long way as well. So just look at the whole picture. And when you do, make sure that you're putting the whole picture in front of the landlord if you're representing the tenant so that you can get the best deal possible. Okay? And I know, like I said, that was the last thing, but I'm going to leave one last tip because one of our agents here the other day did something, and I was like, oh, that was perfect, actually. That's very smart, and that's exactly what I would do, or would have done, and it's perfect. And that's knowing that you have a tenant that has bad financials. When you're setting up or talking to them and looking at potential, if you decide that you still want to work with them, that there's still that potential to be able to work with that client and get them the space. What this agent did was actually call all the listing agents and explain ahead of time, hey, this is what they look like. I don't want to waste anybody's time. I don't want to tour and waste your time if your landlord can't work with us, but here's exactly kind of what the financials look like. And surprisingly, yeah, there were some that said, yeah, no, my landlord's not going to accept it. But quite a few said, you know what, it's worth the tour. Bring them in there, let's look and let's negotiate. And they're negotiating, I believe, on one of the properties right now that said that. Now, So don't just turn it down just because. You have to make that decision of how it's gonna work, but that agent, by being upfront and explaining to the brokers ahead of time, one, allows them to set the picture for their landlord, for their client, so what they can expect, and set those expectations so that they're a little bit more realistic, and it's gonna help the negotiations that much more when you do decide to move forward, if they decide to move forward. All right, so really, I promise that was it. That is all for today. Yeah, if you have any questions, you guys know where to reach me. If you guys have any questions that are watching, go ahead and DM. I'm sure if you have a question, someone else probably has the same one, so feel free to DM. We'll make sure we get back to you.